Alrighty, students, today is Wednesday, April 15th, and we are going to be talking about depression. First thing we're going to start with, I know we talked about it a little bit, what it kind of looks like, and I just scratched the surface earlier in this unit, but we're going to go into a lot of depth today. First thing we need to understand is what causes depression. One of the big reasons that teens are depressed and that they stay depressed, or a reason that people find it hard to get over their depression, is because they don't have the proper coping mechanisms, or they don't know how to cope with it. And what coping is how do you handle your problems, or how do you deal with your issues. So when we talk about depression, we talk about an inability to cope. We're talking about people who don't handle it the right way. So one of the reasons that teens are depressed is they don't know how to do things that would lead them out of depression. So let's imagine that we have a teenager who's depressed. Well, they have two options. They could either exercise or stay in their room all day and brood, avoid contact with friends and stuff like that. One of those things is going to help you get out of the depression, while the other one is going to make you feel more alone, more alienated. And teens will usually do the other one that gets them in this cycle that keeps them in depression. So when we talk about depression, you can have it, but you have to know how to deal with it too. So one of the big reasons why teens stay depressed is because they don't have the proper coping mechanisms. And I'm going to give you a bunch of coping mechanisms on how to deal with depression eventually. It'll be here somewhere. Number two, changes in brain structure. When you are a little 5-year-old duber running around, it's kind of hard to be depressed because they kind of don't have the self-awareness that a lot of teenagers have. Somebody could say something to a little kid, they'll think about it for 5 seconds, and then they'll go run off and play again. So as you get older, you become more self-aware and you start to question things about yourself. This can lead to a depression because maybe you don't feel the self-confidence. Confidence is something like little kids don't really lack. They have the confidence to say anything and everything. Like little kids will come up and tell you, wow, your hairline's receding. I'm like, thank you. But really, I'm not thanking them. But anyway, as you get older, you become more self-aware. You start to question it. You start to try to fit in more, and it's really hard. And this can lead to depression. So because your brain is changing, where you're becoming more self-aware, and that self-awareness makes you question yourself, that can also lead to depression because it could lower your self-confidence. 3, genetics, brain chemistry. If you have a brain that doesn't produce the endorphins to make you feel happy, you are going to be less happy than other people. Especially if you do something that's supposed to that makes most people happy, and your brain doesn't work where it releases those endorphins, you're more likely to be depressed. That is something that many people might be having. This is where you usually see people get prescribed antidepressants and whatnot, because they don't have the brain chemistry to produce the chemicals that make happiness, or the endorphins that make the happiness happen. Okay? So if they don't have that chemical, they're not going to feel happy, even when they probably should. Okay? So there's nothing we can do for that unless there is antidepressants that make these things work, and I think exercise has been proven to make it work a little bit better. Low serotonin levels, that's one of the chemicals. Traumatic life events. Somebody who suffers a traumatic life event is going to be depressed. If something happens where we're going to use the loss of a loved one or the loss of a pet, you're going to probably be depressed during that time if you truly cared about them. It's just brain chemistry. You had an emotional attachment to it, and the sadness and a different set of endorphins are going to release in the brain, making you depressed. Okay? And here's another big one, drug and alcohol use. And this goes back to number 1. Let's imagine that a teenager is depressed. Okay? And they want to not be depressed. They have 2 options, but, well, they have more than 2 options. But let's imagine they have the choice of going out, exercising, running some laps around the track by themselves, or hanging out with friends. Most kids would hang out with friends. I don't blame them. However, let's imagine you're with these friends while you're under a depression, and they offer you drugs and alcohol, and somebody were to take the drugs and alcohol. You may have a temporary drunk or highness that allows people to forget about their depression, or it makes them unaware of their depression. Now, because that they weren't depressed during that little bit of time that they were high or drunk, they feel an emotional attachment and they think that they start, well, I'm not depressed when I'm doing that, so I should do that more. This is how psychologically people get into drug addictions. It's that they want to feel happiness, and it might be because maybe they have brain chemistry that doesn't make them feel happiness, yet feeling high makes them think that they are. So they get hooked on these drugs in this case. Or it could be that they've had a traumatic life event and then suddenly they turn to drugs and alcohol to cope. They don't know how to properly deal with the problem. So how do they deal with the problem? Well, by taking drugs and alcohol. This is why it's really important that we learn proper coping mechanisms. Because if you don't learn how to cope with your problems, one of the downsides or one of the bad coping mechanisms many people choose is drugs and alcohol. And drugs and alcohol are actually depressants, meaning they depress the system. Everything slows down when you're on these drugs, okay, or alcohol. So it doesn't make depression better, it makes it worse. So those are what causes depression in teens. Now, we're not talking about things that can make you feel depressed, such as bullying and such as that. Those are there. We're talking about the main root causes of why somebody stays depressed, okay? And bullying and those things are certainly up there. I'm not saying it's impossible, but these are some of the big reasons why people start the depression and stay in their depression, okay? They can't cope, they use drugs and alcohol, genetics, no chemicals in the brain, and they get older, so they're more self-aware of the changes in brain structure. Okay, those will be in the notes. So what happens if we don't treat our depression? Okay, some kids have been like, I've been depressed for like 2-3 years, nothing terrible has happened to me. Well, maybe you're either underplaying depression or you don't completely understand it. I'm not saying that you are depressed, because it's very possible you could be. How does it affect kids? If kids are in a prolonged state of depression, when you are depressed, you're not able to focus or think right. So your school performance or your grades go down. And what happens when your grades go down? Do you feel happier or sadder? Most kids would feel sad, or they would get more depressed. So if you're in a depression and your school grades start to fall, now you're going to get into more of a depression and you keep going downward. This is why depression is so dangerous, because it affects parts of your life that are actually going to make you feel more depressed and more helpless and make you feel more hopeless. Okay? If your grades keep falling, you're not going to have a lot of hope. But you have to understand that the reason you feel that way is because you might be depressed, and we have to adopt healthy coping mechanisms. 2, social isolation. People who are depressed want to be alone. What we know about this, and what quarantine should have taught all of you, is that when you're not with your friends, you tend to be a little bit more depressed. So when you're in a depression and you want to be alone, to an extent that's okay, but at some point you have to go see your friends, because that will ultimately make you feel happier. Okay? 3, drug addictions. People who are depressed tend to turn to drugs, and I talked about that a little bit already. Why? They want something to make the depression go away, and they think that drugs and alcohol are going to help that. Okay? That's a side effect of being depressed. Other addictions, so social media addictions, other mental illnesses could happen. 5, physical illnesses. When you get depressed and you put yourself in this terrible mindset and you're stuck there. Remember how I said how your mind feels, the body will follow? This is what happens. When you think and you constantly think these horrible, depressing thoughts, your body will actually slow down. People with depression have weaker immune systems. People with depression are more likely to get sick. And it's all because they're putting themselves with these negative thoughts, and their mind is actually affecting the body. It's really hard to understand. Just know this. However your mind thinks, your body will follow. If your mind thinks that it's going to be sick and terrible, it's going to be sick and terrible. You heard me at the beginning of the year. Remember when I said Mr. Durando doesn't get sick? I've only missed one day because of food poisoning. That's something out of my control. I'm never sick. I never believe I'm going to get sick. Even in a situation where I probably will get sick, I don't think about it. Okay? It's one of those things. And people who think they get sick all the time tend to get sick all the time. Okay? Now, there are things that are outside our circumstances. I'm a relatively healthy individual. But how your mind thinks, your body will follow. Mental disorders. People who suffer depression are more likely to suffer anxiety and have other mental issues. Why? Because when you put your brain under these constant stress and chemicals, it's going to rewire itself, and one of the side effects of this rewiring is that you have other mental illnesses. Suicide attempts. If depression goes unchecked, you may have thoughts of suicide, and suicidal attempts are possible. This is why it's really important we learn to deal with depression. And when I say deal with depression, I don't mean that this is a fight that you have on your own. I mean that sometimes you have to ask others for help. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's why we have guidance counselors in the school. I really hate teaching this lesson because we have a big conversation and I only have so much time to talk about this. But it's really important that we have these conversations and we talk to people. And who do you guys tend to talk to is one another. You don't tend to talk to adults. And as much as Mr. Durando thinks he's very intelligent, when kids tell me that they're having these issues, I'm not the best person to help you. Not because I don't want to, but because our guidance counselors and the people that have studied and worked their whole life to understanding this know so much more than me. So one of the first things that happen when kids tell me that they're feeling sad or something is that I tell you to go to the guidance office. Not because I don't want to hear you talk, like I will listen and I will talk to you as long as you can. But the people down there are way better than I am, okay? And they have more training. So when you talk to your friends, that's good. But at some point, you have to go get an adult help and let that adult put you in the right spot, in the right place to get the help that you need. Otherwise, we're going to have a very bad situation because many kids don't have the training necessary to help you through this, okay? And if you're a person that has one of your friends who said this or has threatened themselves with suicide, it's really important that you go to the guidance office. You may feel like you're betraying their trust, but at the other time, you're saving a life, okay? So it's really important that if you're in this situation and you hear somebody talking about these kinds of things, that you go and get help. We got about 2 minutes left. Tomorrow, we will be talking about what are the signs and symptoms of suicide. So we're going to get really heavy into this topic. I'm going to talk about what things you should be looking for. If you see these things, you need to go and get help. If you see your friends having these things, you need to go tell somebody. And it's really important. And this is usually the point in time, because Mr. Durando has had 2 or 3 friends when he was in college who had something similar to this. And you have to go get them help. I would tell you those stories, but we're short on time today. Here's what I want you to do. I just want you to, let me look. Actually, no work today. We're going to wait till tomorrow until we finish everything about depression, and then we'll go from there. That concludes today's lesson. If you have any questions, if you need to talk to somebody, because we're hitting that point where we're talking about really heavy stuff and maybe some thoughts have come up, please email me. The guidance counselors are able to be emailed during this time. Just let me know, okay? Have a wonderful day. Thank you.